Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Institute. In the interest of brevity, I'm going to say very, very little, except to say this is not the two Ronnies. We are not related at all. I'm sure Ben is delighted by that fact. Yet again, we're back looking at Iraq. Ben has some very, very interesting things to say, and perhaps one of the benefits of Chilcot was that it actually allowed him to put in a freedom of request, a freedom of information request, and to get his own report declassified, which he's now going to share with us. So, Ben, the floor is yours.
In 2010, the British Army produced its own analysis of the post-conflict stabilisation of Iraq and the lessons of those difficult operations. I was the leader of the team that did this. On publication, the report was classified. It was one of the several thousand documents referenced by the recent Iraq inquiry in the section on British military equipment, but there was much more to the report than that. We've published it today on the Institute website, and the executive summary will be available for all of you to take away. The aim of the report was to analyse the tactical lessons from the Iraq campaign from 2005 to 2009. In the event, we found that our analysis had to go back to the immediate aftermath in southern Iraq of the 2003 invasion, as the actions of the US-led coalition and its British element set the conditions for subsequent events. How we did it. It was based on a year's work, including analysis of 1,500 post-operation reports and interviews, and a two-day conference of 120 senior officers and officials. The draft was reviewed by a reference group of a dozen serving and retired generals with Iraqi experience, and there are several people in the audience who helped us with this task, for which I'm very grateful. Now, without exception, the then British Army senior leadership strongly supported the work. There were no constraints. We were encouraged to be as critical as we wanted. I was also charged with identifying the lessons of the Iraq War that were relevant to the then contemporary British operations in Afghanistan. And if we assessed that there were any lessons from Iraq that weren't being applied by British troops in Helmand province, I was to say so, and once I did. Now, the report analyses the full spectrum of post-conflict military operations in southern Iraq. It speaks for itself, as I think did the willingness of the army and its then senior leadership to accept the analysis, including uncomfortable judgments. This includes many areas where the British military and government performance could have been improved, but it also identified what worked, an issue too often ignored by commentators and the media. For example, most of the Army's people, units and formations performed well, often outstandingly so. And although the Army and the Ministry of Defence initially struggled to adapt to the unanticipated demands of the war, from 2007, many new equipments were rapidly deployed to Iraq, and they started saving lives and increasing military capability. And many of those were then subsequently deployed to Afghanistan. Now, the report itself, and that's what the hard copy looks like, was published internally by the Army in 2010. I was subsequently invited to brief it to a military history conference at Sandhurst in 2011, which was sponsored by General Wall, the then head of the Army. And the transcript of my talk was subsequently published in the British Army Review. And in 2011 and 2012, I also briefed the topic to the Army Division of Staff College and to the commanders of brigades going to Afghanistan. And again, I was encouraged to say what I wanted as long as it was relevant. Now, I'm happy to take questions on any aspect of that report and also my analysis of the Iraq inquiry and the comparison between the two. But in the meantime, I want to cover three things, none of which, in my judgment, are adequately concisely covered by the Iraq inquiry. And these three things are the key contours of the British campaign in southern Iraq, what those British operations tell us about the nature and character of conflict, and also what they tell us about military adaptation. Starting with the contours of the war, you'll find this quite difficult to discern from the Iraq inquiry, But can I recommend this excellent book recently published by Tim Ripley, Operation Telic, which is a really good narrative history from start to finish of the British campaign in southern Iraq. There is none better. Okay, in 2003, we get an early failure of the coalition in the UK to have a positive impact on the Iraqis. And of course, that rapidly eroded not only any support that might have been given by the Iraqi people, but created the conditions for the Sunni insurgency and the rise of Shia militias. So the stabilisation operation became war in a broken country against enemies who rejected Western values and fought and died. The increasing unpopularity of the war amplified this, and British troops were faced with far greater challenges than they had experienced at any time since perhaps the Korean War. Now, for most of the time, US and Iraqi efforts were concentrated on the Sunni insurgency and the Al-Qaeda insurgency. The US regarded the Shia in the south as a different, less serious problem to be dealt with once the Sunni insurgency and Al-Qaeda were neutralised. The links between Shia parties, government members and militias with death squads often inhibited action against them, and the role of the British in the south was clearly economy of force. President Bush said, "As the Iraqis stand up, we will stand down," a strategy of transition, building the Iraqi forces as fast as possible and withdrawing US forces to large forward operating bases. And this neither built up Iraqi capability sufficiently nor neutralised the Sunni Al-Qaeda insurgency. Concurrently, though, in northern and western Iraq, some US counterinsurgency operations were succeeding, notably at Al-Qaim and Tal Afar, and they succeeded where sufficient US and Iraqi forces applied enduring counterinsurgency principles through a systematic clear, hold and build approach and measures of population control. And at Ramadi in 2006, a similar approach and the US embracing Sunni tribes who were opposed to Al-Qaeda created a decisive point in the campaign. But in the rest of Iraq in 2006, ethno-sectarian strife was inflamed by Al-Qaeda, particularly its bombings of the Samarra Mosque. So by mid-2006, the transition strategy had failed and the Iraqi government was unwilling to confront Shia militias. In January 2007, President Bush replaced transition by a new strategy of surging troops to conduct counterinsurgency, protect the population, and to create sufficient security and space for reconciliation and politics. This, of course, exploited the Anbar awakening. It also exploited the growing capability and confidence of the Iraqi forces and achieved tactical success in reversing the deteriorating security situation. In southern Iraq, to the British commanders and staff officers, it often seemed that in London there was not a formally agreed interagency operational plan for Basra set in a strategic framework across Whitehall. Indeed, I could not find a document that represented that until 2009. No one person was formally in charge in theatre. Success was too dependent on personal relationships. Roadside bombs fielded by Shia militants, the explosively formed projectiles, or EFP, constrained the British ability to build the Iraqi security forces, as did the UK decision not to provide embedded mentoring teams, which the US were providing in Iraqi security forces. In 2006, an operation in Basra, Operation Sinbad, had some local tactical success, but it didn't change the Basra political dynamic, nor the unwillingness of the Iraqi government security forces to take on Basra's militias. By now, Britain was fighting a war with the Shia militias, and heavy fighting took place. I call this period the war against the Jam, the Jaish al-Mahdi, the Shia militia, and this saw fighting as intense as anywhere else in Iraq and many UK casualties. And also, from 2006, the UK had insufficient resources to sustain both the Iraq war and the increasingly difficult operations in Afghanistan. So when the US decided to surge additional troops into Iraq, Britain declined and UK and US strategies diverged. From a position of increasing weakness, the British made an accommodation with Shia militias in Basra, conceding control of Basra to their rule in return for a ceasefire deal which undoubtedly saved British lives. But the contradictions of British strategy in Iraq were unforgivingly exposed by the Easter 2008 Iraqi government attack into Basra, Operation Charge of the Knights, which initially failed. Despite the operation's eventual success, the US discovery of the weaknesses of British forces in Basra damaged their reputation with the US and with the Iraqis and inflicted a major dent in British military self-confidence. So the Sunni awakening and the US surge had created the security and political conditions to allow Prime Minister Maliki to redefine the Shia extremists as insurgents. And without those, the whole campaign would have almost certainly have failed, and the British part in it as well. So, the changing character of the conflict. What does the Iraq War tell us? Well, operations in Iraq were subject to great friction and uncertainty. The Iraqi authorities became increasingly assertive as time went on. The environment was extremely complex, with strategic, operational and tactical levels often overlapping, and there was a political dimension often to tactical operations. What it reminded us was the inherent unpredictability of war, in which the enemy's got a vote and may fight to the death to cast it. It reminds us that war is a clash of wills between human actors seeking to shape events to suit their political aims. They're trying to gain and exploit all the advantages they can. And attrition, manoeuvre, symmetric and asymmetric military approaches all had their roles. The war demonstrates the enduring application of what JFC Fuller called the constant tactical factor, where every improvement is checked by a counter-improvement, action-reaction dynamics between all the parties to the conflict. Now, what happened in Iraq also reflected the changing nature of those actors, the coalition campaign and Iraqi politics, in a highly complex, challenging, dynamic, multinational and interagency setting. The initial land campaign, of course, had been thoroughly planned, and it unrolled in a linear fashion. But the subsequent stabilisation of Iraq became increasingly non-linear, that is, with many variable factors which interacted with each other in complex and constantly changing ways. General Petraeus has been quoted as saying that war's not a linear phenomenon, it's a calculus, not arithmetic. Often success in Iraq depended on the political climate and context, and the attitude, capability and will of the Iraqi authorities and security forces, another factor too often overlooked by many commentators. For example, there were a number of operations where the Iraqi government gave prior consent only for them to repudiate the operation after it had happened. For example, the British destruction of the militia-controlled Jamiat police station in Basra on Christmas Day 2006, and a US operation in Baghdad in 2007 to interdict Shia death squads operating from Sadr City, which was vetoed by Prime Minister Maliki. And it seems that the operations were so close to the envelope of Iraqi government sensitivities that by succeeding, they threatened the Iraqi government's political support from some of their more extreme supporters. Other examples include London's increasing sensitivity to casualties, one factor that led to the British initially opting out of embedding mentors in the Iraqi forces. So was Operation Sinbad, where inadequate resourcing and support by both British and Iraqi governments contributed to its resulting failure to convert local tactical success into operational or political advantage. And the 2007 British accommodation with the Shia militias was in part an effort to minimise casualties, a direct result of the increasing unpopularity of the war in the UK. Another factor may have been lack of understanding by both the United States and British forces. It's not clear that all British plans began with the Iraqi viewpoint and considered outcomes from their perspectives. They were more likely to succeed when they worked with the forces in Iraqi society and politics, not against them, and they were more likely to fail when they imposed solutions on them. Now, these operations were often characterised by British officers as nation building under fire or armed politics, and the counterinsurgency operations were essentially contests for the minds of the people, the populations, the insurgents, the militias, and their military and political leaders. There's nothing new about this. This has been a factor of insurgency and counterinsurgency for some time. But the wars also confirmed that the classic principles of insurgency and counterinsurgency still applied, including the primacy of politics, addressing the root causes of the insurgency, making progress across all areas of governance and development, retaining legitimacy, and operating within the law, and also the value of propaganda to the insurgents and information operations to the counterinsurgents. We shouldn't forget that all coalition efforts were subject to great friction and uncertainty. All of this meant that events in Iraq often defied the simple characterisation found in textbooks or in military doctrine. A wide range of insurgents, militias, US, coalition and Iraqi activities, politics and military operations at the strategic, operational and tactical levels were constantly overlapping and impacting on each other. For example, there was considerable overlap between militias, organised criminals and political and religious extremists and death squads, and crime and extortion often funded militia and insurgent activity. The conflict saw plenty of examples of the factors that Clausewitz identified as distinguishing war from other activities: the effects of danger, the difficulties of gaining sufficient, accurate, timely information, the summer heat which had to be experienced to be believed, which Clausewitz would have described as exertion, and the pervasive presence of friction. These all applied in Iraq, as did the war's contest of wills and its political nature. And on the basis of these simple principles was overlaid complex multiple conflicts and pervasive media reporting, for example by CNN and Al Jazeera, and increasingly as the war went on by the internet. And those all greatly accelerated passage of information of various degrees of truth, falsehood and exaggeration. For those of you who are students of the military art or theorists, what we see is something as if we've got a pile of books. We start with Clausewitz, on top of it we put Hobbes, then Machiavelli, and then we put the DVD set of George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, and over that House of Cards. Then we shred them and spin them in a powerful centrifuge. That's the best way to see it. Now, this interpenetration and interdependence of war and politics increased complexity, but it also created opportunities and risks and threats for all actors. Or, as British Lieutenant General Lamb, then Deputy Commander of MNFI, put it in 2007, and this is an edited version of what he said. This is as complex as anything I've done. This is three-dimensional chess in a dark room. So, my final topic, and we're on the home stretch now, is adaptation. And I'm doing quite a bit of work on this elsewhere in the Institute. And it seems to me that armed forces that want to stay relevant and usable need to do three different things, which I show up on the slide. And failure to do any of those means that over time they become less effective. Now, my army career, which lasted from 1975 to 2010, had seen success in adaptation outweighing failures to adapt. Northern Ireland, the British Army contribution to the Falklands War, and indeed the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force contribution to the Falklands War, and in Bosnia. Now, what rather shocked me was an increasing awareness as I did the work that the successes of adaptation were less than the failures to adapt. In the previous conflicts, the successes of adaptation had been greater than the failures. It was the other way round in Iraq. Now, there was much hard fighting and good tactical adaptation and learning by troops in contact. But I found, failures to adapt greater than the successes. Now, this slowly changed for British troops in Afghanistan, not least as a result of General Sir David Richards, as he was at the time, as Commander-in-Chief, using something called Operation Entirety to put the army on more of a war footing. Now, as both Iraq and Afghanistan was going on, there were many British Army senior officers who claimed that in Iraq and Afghanistan the army transformed in contact, a phrase which runs neatly off the tongue. This was in part true, but I'm afraid I saw too many areas where change was too slow. I also saw good evidence that important areas, the US Army and US Marine Corps in Iraq, changed and adapted faster than the British. Now, this of course is against the background of British strategy, operational design and tactical approach in Iraq coming within a wafer's thinness of failure. But that position was recovered and redeemed as much by US and Iraqi efforts as by ours. And the accumulated body of testimony to the Iraq inquiry and many of its key conclusions points to suboptimal strategic leadership, starting at the top with Prime Minister Tony Blair, but including other senior politicians and, I'm afraid, at times, senior officers and senior government officials, and by key government departments, including the Ministry of Defence. And a general sentiment amongst many of the people I interviewed who were rank-ranged from major to full general, and something that came out of many of the post-operation reports and interviews was a general sense of we could have done better and we should have done better. I came to the same conclusion. So why was this? I've identified some key factors. They're by no means complete, and of course they overlap. The first one, overconfidence. The relative success of the US and NATO military operations in the 1990s in Bosnia and Kosovo, and indeed Desert Storm before that, was the result of opponents being less capable, less modernised and less motivated. And I think this created overconfidence, which was reinforced by the attractions of the Revolution in Military Affairs concept, the RMA, which saw a modernised networked force defeating less modernised conventional adversaries, which of course is what happened in Desert Storm. But the RMA concept was not, I believe, ever adequately tested against insurgents. And of course the initial regime change interventions, what was a highly innovative and adaptive concept of operations for the defeat of Taliban in Afghanistan, and then the opening rounds of Operation Iraqi Freedom in Iraq, they appeared to confirm the validity of the revolution in military affairs. But at the time, insufficient attention was paid to the considerable weakness of the Taliban and Iraqi forces, who were themselves unable to adapt quickly enough. But these two victories, I think, gave false confidence to US Secretary of Defence Donald Rumsfeld and to many others that Iraq and Afghanistan could be fairly quickly stabilised with minimal forces. So those two successes and the RMA misled as much as they informed, which contributed to strategic miscalculation. And this was exacerbated by both the US Army and the British Armed Forces deliberately choosing to neglect the study and teaching of insurgency and counterinsurgency. Adaptation by both nations was often too slow. A significant factor was that defence bureaucracies, such as the Pentagon and the UK MOD, tended at times to want to continue with business as usual. In the case of the Pentagon, it was only when Defence Secretary Robert Gates imposed a sense of insurgency on the Pentagon, the US Army and the US Air Force that they began to apply the necessary energy and sense of urgency that the wars demanded. Now, this isn't a new problem, as bureaucracies always have inertia, but forcing bureaucracies to recognise that business as usual won't meet the imperatives of a war like Iraq, and that they must adapt to the war they have rather than the one they want. Now, that's a key role of strategic leaders. Now, secondly, we have to recognise that changing, adapting technology and fielding new technology can often be slow. When responding to an unanticipated challenge, technological adaptation in the Iraq War often took longer than altering tactics, techniques or procedures, which could be changed relatively quickly, particularly when driven by military commanders. Identifying technological solutions to new problems was always going to take time, even when equipment could be acquired off the shelf. And if additional research and development was required, additional time would be needed. Now, what that also reinforces is the importance of intelligence organisations trying to get ahead of the curve technologically, to look where enemy technologies going and where technology might offer options to the next enemy initiative. Thirdly, candour and dialogue. Now, I looked at much of the contemporary dialogue within the US Army and Marine Corps. It was striking in its candour, more so as much of it was in relatively open forums. It was often self-critical and reflective about what was working and what was not, and showed a healthy exchange of ideas, not just between tactical practitioners, but also flowing from senior officers through company commanders, both directions, and also including enlisted ranks. Some key senior leaders in the US Army and the Marine Corps seemed confident enough to take critical feedback from their subordinates, and also supported good ideas and what worked with resources and influence. Indeed, a British officer who served in Baghdad described the US approach to this dialogue as one of brutal frankness. The overall impression I got was that this dialogue was stronger and more productive in the US Army and Marine Corps than it was in the British Army. And the fourth point is leadership. Now, the successful adaptations that were eventually made show that whilst technology can assist with adaptation, the key enablers and barriers are leadership, culture, and mental and organisational agility. It's striking that a number of significant capability weaknesses that I looked at appeared to have arisen because of a default setting of top-down being applied to a tactical problem that required the thinking to be applied and prioritised from the bottom up. And I saw real hard evidence of this applying to intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance in the British operation in Iraq, to information operations, to the comprehensive approach. For example, the great difficulties the British had in passing British money to British commanders to use money as a weapon system, as opposed to the great flexibility that US commanders had to do this. What also struck me was that bottom-up adaptation by military units was most successful when complemented by top-down adaptation, and particularly by direction and support. And bottom-up adaptations couldn't succeed outside the unit that had made them without the engagement, encouragement and enthusiasm of the leadership. And top-down adaptation worked best when it was actually driven by the high-level leadership. Robert Gates put it like this: it's also essential that organisations are prepared to move outside their comfort zones. And some of the reluctance to change that Robert Gates identified in the Pentagon and in the US Air Force, I identified in the British Army. And it seems to have been caused by an unwillingness of the organisation and the subordinate organisations within it to make culturally uncomfortable decisions, and a reluctance to bend themselves out of their peacetime shape. Now, not all potential adaptations were then under the British Army's control. For example, equipment at the time, the setting of the requirement, was centralised in the Ministry of Defence, and the high-level campaign management was in the Ministry of Defence and the Permanent Joint Headquarters, as indeed was the media strategy. But I identified plenty of areas where the Army could have pulled their own levers. Some were pulled, others not. And I think it shows that the Army could have been more flexible and it could have adapted better. Now, in the report, there is a chapter which foolishly I put right at the back on the adaptability of the British Army. I could have kicked myself for that, because perhaps that bit of the report hasn't had the influence as it should. But I've continued to do some work on this and mull it over. And I think I've identified some overall success factors that promote adaptation in armed forces on operations. And I've also tested them against a number of historic examples, and not just land warfare historic examples. I think they speak for themselves. I think all this has some implications for the UK. It is fair to say that many of the hard lessons of Iraq were successfully applied to Afghanistan, And as the troops in Iraq started drawing down, key equipment like the Mastiff armoured vehicle were also shifted from Iraq to Afghanistan. And that worked well. I think many of the hard lessons are reflected in the restructuring of the army that started in 2012 and is still happening. And I think the formation of 77 Brigade, with its responsibility for non-military effects, for capacity building and for information operations, is one example of this. Another is the formation of the Intelligence, Surveillance and Reconnaissance Brigade, the rather innovative combined search EOD group, which combines Royal Engineers search regiments with the Royal Logistics Corps EOD specialists, and also with an entire regiment of military working dogs. Again, that's another innovative structure, as indeed is the structure of the British Artillery. Quite clearly, the revival of the National Security Council by the previous coalition government provided a high-level forum for coordinated discussion and progress checking that appears to have been considerable weaknesses at times in the strategic management of the Iraq War. And I think UK defence reform, something again there hasn't been enough commentary on, was a radical change to the way the Ministry of Defence did its business, where crippling centralisation of responsibility for equipment, accountability and finance was reversed, and the money and many of the key responsibilities given back to the three services. Now, there's a lot I've not covered. The report sections include force preparation, understanding, intelligence, command and control, operations, protection, information operations, reconstruction, security sector reform, equipment, logistics, personnel, medical, and the lessons that might be learned from the enemy. So there's a lot I've left out specifically to offend quite a few ex-military people in the audience. And I've not covered my critical analysis of the Iraq inquiry, but that's available to you as a review article in Survival. And I don't want to get emotional to it, but this is what at the time was quite a famous photo taken when the British Army handed Basra over to the 10th Mountain Division. And it's the Basra Wall, which is being recreated at the National Memorial Arboretum. Those of you close to the front can see on the left the badge of my former regiment and the name of Lance Corporal Thomas, whose funeral in Welshpool I had the privilege to attend in 2004. A funeral where Welshpool came to a stop, and a town with a population of about 9,000. We reckon there were 12,000 people lying on the streets. And that is a terrible privilege that goes with high rank and being a tribal elder in the curious way our military system has tribal elders. But the thing about Lance Corporal Thomas is actually he was a volunteer of a platoon from 2nd Light Infantry that went to reinforce the Cheshires, and how he died was counterattacking an ambushing party of Shia militia. So he certainly marched to the sound of the guns. So I don't want to sound sentimental, but I'd welcome any questions, any criticism, any better ideas. And also, I'm more than happy to talk about the myriad of topics I haven't addressed this morning.
In the time-honoured fashion, if you can just identify yourself and your affiliation when you ask the first question.
Paul Schultz in the MOD and in Baghdad in 2004. Fascinating, but three immediate questions came up. You've drawn conclusions which sound very sensible. Do you think they've been widely understood in the country? Have we adequately digested what was a strategic failure but was presented by all governments of all parties as a splendid success, arms combining it successfully together? And until we understand that, will we adequately learn the lessons? Secondly, some of the lessons which have been learned about Basra seem to be being hijacked in terms of human security and the DFID agenda. If you look at their descriptions of Basra, you will see almost no discussion of Charge of the Knights and the hard power of re-establishing control. And final question, could it have been very much better given the numbers, the Quinlivan ratios in the background, providing that there were numerical caps on British troops, however innovative they'd been, could the outcome have actually been very different?
That's three questions. The first one is that what I saw in 2011 and 2012 was the Army, bits of MOD and PJHQ, as they were grappling with Afghanistan, particularly the transition, were very keen to understand what had and hadn't worked in transition in Iraq. And I quite often had my collar felt to talk to people about it. I think I did mention that I think in terms of structure and equipment, for the Army, many of those hard lessons are reflected in its evolving organisation. I think also if you look at the Royal Air Force, its organisation, its capabilities, many of the key air power lessons of Iraq and indeed of Afghanistan are also reflected in their capabilities, particularly the balance between offensive air, combat support, airborne ISR and strategic lift. Although I would note that to our knowledge in IISS, there's never been such a lessons learned exercise for the Air Force or the Royal Navy in the way that the Army actually commissioned 3 lessons learned exercises, only one of which reported after the Iraq War. I have to be fair to the Ministry of Defence here, as Defence Secretary Fallon said to the House of Commons Defence Committee, they have commissioned a lessons learned exercise, which is part of a cross-government lessons learned exercise that is being masterminded by the Cabinet Office, and indeed the current Permanent Secretary put quite a thoughtful blog piece on the MOD blog. Let's see what comes out of it and how rigorous and searching it's going to be. From my point of view, what it does do is it provides the current high-level national security team, the ministers, the senior officers and senior officials, none of whom were involved in Iraq in that capacity. It provides them some really hard scenarios and lessons against which to test the way they're doing business. With regard to DFID, I don't have that sense. What I do have a sense is that many military officers, not just Army, thoroughly get the message about human security and heading off problems and the importance of development. What I think is a pity, though, in the Iraq inquiry is it really dismisses events after Operation Charge of the Nights. And actually there was good work done by DFID, the FCO, and both Army units and the Royal Marines Amphib-4 headquarters. There was good work to energise and deliver the comprehensive approach, albeit in a much more benign security environment. What was your third question?
Could it have been different given
Yes.
the numbers?
Now, buried away in the report, we did look at this because this was something that frequently came up. So myself and my little team decided to spend an amusing afternoon doing counterfactuals. And I think what that showed us were there were 3 occasions when things could have been done differently. The first one was a point in sort of mid-2003 when it becomes very clear, including the Iraq inquiry shows to Prime Minister Blair on a visit, that progress isn't being made quickly enough, there's a lot of threats. Well, at that stage, if a decision had been taken to sustain a large-scale UK commitment rather than a medium-scale commitment, something that would have required a lot of hard decisions, and also to back that up with the comprehensive approach and development resources, there was a chance then that the deterioration of the situation in Basra could have been reversed. Another opportunity where the same applied was after the sheer uprisings in 2004, when what British commanders were reporting in many cases was that ordinary decent Basmaris were thoroughly fed up with the sheer militias. Now, I'm not saying either of those would have worked. There is also the question on Operation Sinbad. It is said that the governor of Basra, when General Richard Sheriff briefed Operation Sinbad to him, he said, that all sounds very good, but you need 2 more brigades, Richard. If Operation Sinbad had been a divisional level surge, there is a chance it could have had more effect and could have reached the tipping point of positive effect. The difficulties of doing so, of course, were formidable. At that stage, things were going very much not according to plan in Afghanistan. The British forces were also at the limit of key protective equipment. There wasn't much more additional armour, additional intelligence and surveillance systems. So a reinforcing brigade or two would have been at additional risk, and the increase in fighting inevitably would have caused more civilian casualties and collateral damage. But in a sense, a British surge into Basra could have had the same effect as the US surge. By then, remember, the war becoming increasingly unpopular, and it would have required, as indeed all of these counterfactuals would have required, the putting of the armed forces on a war footing. You know, for example, the then British contingent in Bosnia in 2003-2004 being told, you think you're staying for 6 months? You're staying on until things are better in Iraq. That sort of decision. But there we are.
There's a question in the third row now.
Justin Byrne, double IWS member. Ben, you talk, and not just you, but almost everybody, with interchangeability almost about the Iraq War, about stabilisation, about coin. And these are actually different things. And Clausewitz is keen on the idea of understanding what it is you put yourself into so that you can respond in the appropriate military fashion. I mean, to what extent do you think that the difficulty in identifying what it was that the armed forces were engaged in actually led to some of the shortcomings and failures and lack of adaptation and innovation?
Easy question.
You hit the nail on the head, Desmond. I, of course, am guilty of considerable oversimplification. One of the things that's striking in contemporary reports by British commanders after the invasion in 2003-2004 is that they considered what they were doing had more to do with a peace support operation than counterinsurgency. On the other hand, if they'd been looking at it through a counterinsurgency lens, they might then have seen some of the risk factors that were building, for example, identifying the Shia militias as effectively an insurgency in being that was growing. I think the same applied to many key US individuals. I think another problem was, and this certainly was a factor in 2007, that because of the rapid growth of the threat, intelligence optimised itself for force protection. It did not optimise itself for understanding the wider situation, particularly the political currents. And as General Jonathan Shaw, who was commanding in Basra in mid-2007, said in his testimony to the Iraq inquiry, he actually had to give direction to the intelligence organisation to devote some of its intelligence resources to political intelligence so that it could achieve better understanding. But in terms of your proposition, Desmond, absolutely right.
There's a question in the second row, and then I'll come to you.
Ben, Dick Applegate, about this time I suppose responsible for delivering UORs and logistics support to Afghanistan and Iraq. Where to start? I think some observations really. I'll use your piece about over-centralised provision of equipment being a significant weakness. Just a sort of bit of a challenge. I think some of the solutions that had to be delivered required something that was beyond the competence of an army to understand, because of the nature of how they pick as joint assets. And I would observe going forward, it would be interesting to see the way the new construct can deliver broader options. An observation there. I think a piece that you miss early on in both operations is that fundamentally this was financed by Treasury money, and therefore Treasury approval and a definition of need made it reactive. It was only quite late on that we managed to put in place proactive provision of such equipment, for example, to deal with snipers, because somebody else was saying. Now, the reason I make it and go on from there is I'm not convinced going forward under defence change and everything else that's going on, and from seeing observations from what happened in Afghanistan, which, to be frank, I don't think was much better till quite late, and then what happened in Mali and elsewhere, that the body that we call the MOD, that defence institution, is any better placed to manage such challenges. I think it is still essentially a reactive organisation. It is incredibly risk averse. Yeah, and your point about developing a cutting edge force requires a willingness to experiment and occasionally to fail, but albeit under controlled conditions. I have yet to see any evidence that that is the sort of culture that is being bred within defence. Can I comment?
You make a very good case for the prosecution, and those of you who are going to look at the report, Dick, in his previous capacity, there's a very incisive quote about UORs that reflects much of this, which was itself lifted and inserted into the Chilcot sectional post-conflict equipment. Yes, but I had seen a model that worked because I'd served 3 times in Northern Ireland, where there was an adaptive enemy, but the whole cycle seemed to work better. And why did it work better? First of all, because they had science and technology actually integrated in what was the theatre headquarters, HQ Northern Ireland. And both the scientific advisor and indeed the whole chain of command in Northern Ireland was always looking for opportunities to get ahead of the curve. And I once or twice rolled up my sleeves and got involved in that. They also had very good relations with what was then the state-owned R&D machine, particularly at Malvern and Fort Halstead, and also with some parts of industry who had quite a leading edge in that. And it seems you got a virtuous circle and a relationship between fielding the new technology, reacting to technological initiatives from the IRA, and training tactics and procedure. And when I commanded a multinational brigade in Bosnia in 2003, where I was also the British National Contingent Commander, I rather expected that Permanent Joint Headquarters was going to add the same value. I was a bit disappointed when quite often they didn't. And although getting this right, things got less bad, and then there were successes, which it's quite right to celebrate. That sort of, those sort of relationships seem to be present by their absence too often, particularly in the first half of the Iraq War. I'd also offer that there was clash of cultures. A good example of a clash of culture was UAVs. Now, the Royal Air Force, quite rightly, sees air power as being applied, prioritised at the highest level, directed to support the main effort. And, it's classic principles of air power. What we saw in Iraq was UAVs being used from the small tactical level at every level. And if, for forces that didn't have UAVs, whichever the level of command, not having access to the UAV actually reduced their intelligence and surveillance capability, also weakened their force protection. So in a sense, UAVs needed to be thought of more like the army thinks of artillery or engineers. And I saw a real clash of cultures in that actually it took the Brits too long to respond to, whereas in my report I observed that the Australians and the Italians fielded tactical UAVs more quickly than the British did.
The 2 questions in the front row, I'll take one from Bruce.
Yes, thank you. My name is Bruce George, Right Honourable Bruce George. I was a member of the Defence Committee endlessly, including the period our wonderful speaker has discussed with us. The point I want to make, and I've been retired from Parliament now for 8 years, is how indifferent the MOD and the other agencies were to inform members of Parliament, especially the chairman of the Defence Committee, the indifference, the excuses they made. I'm not suggesting they lied. Most people who knew what I had seen would say, yes, they lied, but I won't be ungenerous. And to have the chairman of the Defence Committee unable to get information from the MOD and others, I found frankly appalling. I just hope, as time has gone by, we would, or members of Parliament and other committees, would be more aware. But to deny evidence to one of the most important committees in Parliament, I found frankly repugnant.
Okay, Barry, thank you so much. We talked about the past. Let us talk about the future. And no doubt there is relation between the past and the future. So regarding to the current situation in Iraq, in your opinion, what should be done by UK to improve the security situation in Iraq, especially that Iraqi military forces are in preparation for al-Mosul battle to push Daesh back? Could you please summarize it? I'm safe from Iraqi embassy.
Yeah. The point about the House of Commons Defence Committee, I looked at my team and I looked at a wide variety of sources, and I can actually, the sense I got from the Defence Committee's reports slightly reflected that frustration. I have to say, though, there are examples of ministers in the MOD stepping up and earning their pay. And if you want, it's not simple. There's an excellent section in the narrative bit on post-conflict operations about errors in the UK method of making strategy, which rings my bell. There's also a section next to it called optimism bias, and it says too often there was too much optimism built in to reporting in London, and it actually personally criticises in quite outspoken forms the then Defence Secretary Des Brown, with an E, for 4 specific occasions when he tendered an over-optimistic report to the Cabinet. On the other hand, there's no doubt in my mind that in 2007, Des Brown played a decisive role in energising what was something that was happening far too slowly, which was the identification and then formulation of the way to quickly improve protected mobility in Basra. Now, he was helped because he had extremely energetic Lord Drayson, who from his motor racing background knew something about vehicle technology. But there was an element there of action this day, and that's actually well covered in the body of the inquiry. And one example that sticks to mind is there's a minute set up by the then Vice Chief, General Sir Tim Granville Chapman, where there's a situation report, and then the minute says, well, actually, we should be able to give you more substance and get things going in the right direction over the next couple of months. And Des Brown has written on it, no, this needs to be done by tomorrow. So there are examples, I think, of ministers playing a proper role. On the point of view of where we are in Iraq now, well, there is a substantial British contingent doing a lot of training and advice. There is also a large Royal Air Force operation, which I'm pretty certain, in terms of the way it's using airborne ISR and also precision attack, particularly with the dual-mode Brimstone missile, which wasn't fielded in sufficient time for Iraq, but made a real difference in Afghanistan. I'm quite sure they're doing what they can. I have to say, one of the things that comes out of the period 2003 to 2009 is Britain had, after Operation Charge of the Knights, Britain had very limited leverage in Baghdad because many key Iraqis, including Prime Minister Maliki, saw Operation Charge of the Knights, particularly the difficulty of the British response, which in part was due to the accommodation with the Shia militia and the fact the British had reduced their situational awareness of Basra. It seems to me that Prime Minister Maliki, saw the British as having failed and let him down. But I would hope that the current Iraqi government is more appreciative.
Tom, you had a question, and then we'll group 3 or 4 together here. So,
Okay.
so Tom first.
Tom Payne, member of the Institute. I wanted to get back to the question of how the Ministry of Defence and indeed the wider government machine could do better in future. You've made a number of points that are relevant to that. You drew the parallel with Northern Ireland. The point that struck me about Northern Ireland was, apart from the fact that you had headquarters in Northern Ireland with people who were being posted there for much longer periods of time, it wasn't, though, the main effort, if you like, of the Ministry of Defence at that time, because there was a Cold War going on for most of it. So what is it exactly? What decisions, what ways in which the Ministry behaves would have made a difference, in your view, in relation to Iraq?
There's a question in the third.
Yes, thank you.
No, sorry, hold. There's a gent here had his hand up first, and then we'll come to you.
Gordon Wilson, a fellow Roostian member here. Give me a single sailor making a few observations. Could you just comment, perhaps? I think about British complacency you've come up with. Nigel Alwyn Foster's paper, which went today, were highly critical of the Americans. It was picked up by David Petraeus when he was in Fort Leavenworth and given blanket distribution to the US Army, which must have hacked off quite a lot of them. But Petraeus then, who when he was in charge of an airborne brigade in part of Iraq, had more stability in his area than anybody else because he was thinking about applying change to this philosophy. And eventually, I think David Petraeus probably achieved more than I think we ever possibly, but within 2 years he changed the ethos and philosophy of the US Army, which I thought would be impossible to do so. And yet we carried on perhaps in the old-fashioned philosophy, and they were far better at counterinsurgency operations, and that aggravated the relationship between the two. Would you agree that Petraeus was a mould breaker, if you like?
Question.
Yes, thank you. Sarah Ingham, researcher to General Lord Dannatt. Surely the main problem with Iraq is that the whole intervention was built on such shaky foundations. It lacked legitimacy and legality. And after 2003, until 2009, the support for it amongst the public seeped away, which led to a complete lack of engagement by the Blair government in parallel. And was there a change of direction, do you think, under Gordon Brown in June 2007 when Blair's wars became his responsibility? Thank you.
Tim, and then we'll come to you.
One of the things that's run through all this Iraq stuff is the psychology of the British Army, and its sort of emphasis on 6-month operational tours, and its sort of packaging and its experience is all about this 6-month period. And how do you break that disconnect to translate it into a mentality of success of a campaign?
James Cunliffe, I'm with the Institute. Same kind of question. In your MOD report, then, did you consult with any Iraqi generals, either in Baghdad or Basra? And if you did they say anything about how long Britain was prepared to commit to the operation, and whether sort of short-termism was a factor?
I'll go in reverse order. One of my regrets was that we never substantially consulted senior Iraqi people in Iraq, but we drew on other consultation that others had done. I just return to my earlier point. There were times when both the British and the United States really didn't think things through from the Iraqi point of view, or indeed consult the increasing number of very capable Iraqi battalion, brigade, divisional commanders. Tim Ripley's point, which also relates actually to Tom's point. The US Army, of course, was rotating people through on 1-year tours, which were sometimes extended to 15 months. Certainly, I think the British military, medical psychologists and psychiatrists think that may play badly in the long term to do with post-traumatic stress disorder, but clearly the jury's out. I read all the General Officer Commanding's post-operation reports from that post-conflict bit, and every other one, somewhere in it you'd find a paragraph saying we've got to do better with campaign continuity. So why don't we do what we did with Northern Ireland and have some people on 2-year postings in jobs specifically to provide that continuity, and they could live on expat terms in Kuwait and commute up and down on a weekly basis. I saw no evidence that had ever been seriously considered, but it certainly could have helped. And it's a bit unfair to criticise people who are probably not represented here, but if there was a weakness in the permanent joint headquarters, it seemed to be not adding the same sort of value to Iraq and what I saw of the Afghanistan campaign that HQ Northern Ireland had added to the Northern Ireland campaign. I think Petraeus and the US discovery of coin. Let me just go on for a bit. This is worth looking up. There is a copy in the Institute Library, which I've got on my shelf. James Russell was a US Navy civilian who basically did a PhD on this at King's College next door. And he did some very credible research on US Marine units and US Army units and brigades in Nineveh and Anbar province between 2004 and 2006. He looked at the negatives as well as the positives. But what he is credibly able to show is that there was quite a lot of bottom-up adaptation that then got energised by the leadership of those battalions and brigades. Of course, there were examples of failures to do this on the US side as well. But Petraeus, by virtue of commanding the Combined Arms Centre, and when he wasn't in Iraq, energising the development of US counterinsurgency doctrine, definitely played a decisive role in this. You know, it's a sad fact that both the UK's Doctrine and Concept Centre producing joint doctrine and the Army producing new land doctrine for coin, those weren't published until 2009, as opposed to 2006 when FM 3/24 was produced. Tom, you posed a very good question. How does government get better? Well, what's striking is that the US government and President Bush made more use of external opinions and outsiders. President Bush's decision to surge, which is taken against the majority of advice he's getting from the US national security establishment, he drew a lot on advice from General Jack Keane and one or two other think tankers in DC. What you also see with Petraeus is him bringing in sort of joint think tanks. He did it in Baghdad, where he got what was then Colonel H.R. McMaster and a mixture of military people, civilians, intelligence people and academics to do a campaign assessment. He did the same thing actually when he took over CENTCOM. And personally, I still feel that there is more organisations like ours could be doing to help the Ministry of Defence in this way. Sarah, your points. It'll be very interesting to see in General Dannett's forthcoming book about the British Army since 1945, Boots on the Ground, what he has to say about Iraq. There's some quite interesting stuff in his memoir, which indeed I drew on in my report. I think what you know, what you do see with the British Army, the Armed Forces, and indeed the Ministry of Defence, and there are very good reasons for this, is sort of rolling over confidence. You then combine it with what is well identified in the Iraq inquiry, with optimism bias, and that's part of the factor. The other factor, I think, is that although Prime Minister Blair, his judgment was often borne out by events, and the Iraq inquiry gives him credit for this, I'm afraid he often seemed to fail to make the decision stick. And in my survival article, I analyse a couple of examples of this. But it is actually pretty shocking how many examples the Iraq inquiry lays out, and there are even more laid out in the testimony that's on its website, of the Prime Minister deciding that something should be done, and then it not being followed up on. And what it tells us, I think, is, you know, strategic leadership. Yes, making the decisions is part of strategic leadership, but setting up some system and occasionally exerting a bit of personal whip-cracking to make sure the decisions are implemented is just as important.
I realise we've run about 10 minutes over time, so I'm going to draw stumps there. I would attempt to summarise that, except Ben has very kindly got me off the hook there as well. There is actually the executive summary of the report, I think, is available.
Yep, you can get them from Monty on the way out.
So, Ben, thank you very much.
Pleasure.